Have you ever been underestimated, mocked, or made to feel like you didn't belong, only to have the last laugh when everyone least expected it? Well, that's exactly what happened to Sarah at Bootcamp. Today, we're diving into a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about first impressions, strength, and legacy. Welcome to Swift Tale, the channel where we share some of the most jaw-dropping, inspiring, and heartwarming true stories you've never heard before. If this is your first time here, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a good story, and subscribe to stay updated with more amazing tales just like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next, because this story is going to have you glued to your screen from start to finish. So let's set the stage. Sarah walked into boot camp with nothing but the drive to prove herself. But instead of encouragement, she faced mockery from her fellow recruits, judged for everything from her appearance to her quiet demeanor. They thought they knew her. They thought she was weak. But there was one thing they couldn't see, the secret that lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the perfect moment to shock them all. This isn't just a story about a tattoo. It's about what happens when someone's past collides with their future in the most unexpected way. Stick around because this story matters more than you might think. Sarah wasn't your typical boot camp recruit. She wasn't tall or muscular or loud. In fact, she stood out for all the reasons people might assume she didn't belong. Standing at just 52, with a lean frame and a quiet, almost introverted nature, Sarah was easy to overlook, at least at first. She came from a small town, raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to make ends meet. Growing up, Sarah learned the importance of hard work and resilience, but she also learned the sting of judgment. People often underestimated her, assuming that because she was small and soft-spoken, she wasn't capable of much. But those who dismissed her didn't know her story, or the deep reservoir of strength she'd been quietly building all her life. When she stepped onto the bus that would take her to boot camp, she was already carrying the weight of everyone's low expectations. She didn't know what to expect from the training, but she knew she had to give it everything she had. She wasn't just proving herself to the others, she was proving it to herself. Her journey to join the military hadn't been easy. There had been doubts, setbacks, and plenty of people telling her she wasn't cut out for it. But Sarah didn't back down. With a quiet resolve and a fire burning deep inside her, she showed up, ready to face whatever came next. But as soon as she arrived, the mocking started. The moment Sarah stepped off that bus, the other recruits gave her the once-over. It was obvious they didn't take her seriously. Whispered comments about her size and appearance echoed through the air. Some recruits even went so far as to call her little girl or mama's girl, as if being a woman or being small meant she didn't have the grit to survive boot camp. Despite the taunts, Sarah held her head high. She didn't fight back with words. She let her actions do the talking. But little did they know, she had something far more powerful hidden beneath her training shirt, something that would make everyone reconsider what they thought they knew about her. The first few days at boot camp were brutal for Sarah. The physical tests were grueling, and the emotional toll was even worse. From the moment the other recruits laid eyes on her, it was clear that they weren't going to make things easy. Every time she struggled with an exercise, there were whispers and laughter behind her back. "Look at her try to lift that," someone would say. "She's gonna get washed out before the first week is even over." Sarah had always known that people could be quick to judge, but hearing it from her own peers, the ones she'd be training with day in and day out, felt like a gut punch. The mocking wasn't just limited to physical abilities. There was the constant commentary on her appearance. Her hair, which she kept in a tight ponytail to stay out of the way, was often the subject of ridicule. "Does she even know how to tie that thing right?" one recruit would joke. And when she failed to meet their expectations in drills, it became a free-for-all. They started calling her names: fragile, delicate, even weakling. Sarah didn't flinch. She knew that they wanted a reaction, but she wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. But it wasn't just the recruits who made her feel out of place. Even some of the instructors seemed to question why she was there. One day during a particularly intense endurance run, Sarah fell behind. Her legs were sore, her chest was burning, and the heat from the midday sun was suffocating. The instructor, a stern sergeant with little patience for slackers, slowed his pace to match hers, his eyes scanning her as if he was evaluating whether she'd even make it to the end of the course. "You better pick up the pace, little one," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't want to be the first one to quit, do you?" Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, not from the run but from the sting of those words. But she didn't quit. She kept running, pushing herself past the pain, past the doubts, and past the voices telling her she didn't belong. Every step she took was a silent declaration that she was not going anywhere. But it was hard. The more she kept quiet and pushed through the ridicule, the more it weighed on her. It felt like every moment at boot camp was a test, one she had to pass, not just for herself, but to prove the world wrong. The hardest part was knowing that they didn't see her. They didn't see the quiet fire inside her, the determination that had been building long before she'd set foot on that base. They saw only what was on the surface, what was easy to mock. But Sarah knew better than anyone that the real strength wasn't always the loudest or the most obvious. It was the kind that stayed hidden, the kind that would one day rise up when it was needed most. As the days went by, the mocking began to fade into the background, but the whispers about Sarah's secret tattoo started to grow louder. It wasn't just the recruits anymore. There was something about her that intrigued them. Sarah had made it through the physical challenges, though not without struggle. Her quiet determination was starting to earn her a grudging respect. But there was one thing none of them could understand: why she never took off her training shirt, even when the rest of the recruits were cooling off after a grueling workout. It wasn't unusual for recruits to wear their shirts during the tougher drills, but when the heat was unbearable, most of them would shed their shirts in a sign of relief. Not Sarah. It was almost as if she had something to hide. During the morning stretches, when everyone else was wiping sweat from their brows and chatting casually, Sarah would stand at the back, her head down, keeping to herself. Her shirt clung to her back, and whenever someone happened to glance her way, they caught glimpses of something underneath, something that looked like a faded design etched into her skin. But no one had the nerve to ask her about it, at least not openly. Then O-Day, while the recruits were getting ready for a team-building exercise in the barracks, someone accidentally caught a glimpse of her tattoo. It wasn't a full view, just a flash as Sarah reached up to grab her gear from the top bunk, but it was enough to spark a round of curious murmurs. The tattoo was huge, stretching from her shoulders down to the small of her back. The image was a military insignia, but it wasn't one the average recruit would recognize. It wasn't some generic design or a simple reminder of service. This was different. The design seemed personal. By that evening, rumors started swirling. Some speculated that it was a tribute to a family member, maybe her father or older brother, someone who had served in the military. Others wondered if it was a symbol of an elite unit, a mark of a soldier who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. No one dared ask Sarah directly, but the curiosity was palpable. The other recruits who had once written her off as weak were now starting to see her in a different light. Her tattoo, hidden away from prying eyes, suddenly made her seem more mysterious, more complex. It was as if the quiet girl in the back had a story they couldn't quite figure out. But Sarah wasn't about to share her story. Not yet. She had learned long ago that people judged based on appearances, and she wasn't about to let her tattoo define her. The design on her back wasn't something she wanted sympathy for or even recognition. It was a piece of her past, something she wore not to gain respect, but to remind herself of why she was there in the first place. She was here to prove her own worth, not to hide behind someone else's legacy. Still, the intrigue grew. There was something about that tattoo, something about the way it looked, like it was tied to a deep, hidden strength. The other recruits couldn't quite figure it out, but one thing was certain. Sarah was no ordinary recruit, and the tattoo was a clue to a past she wasn't ready to reveal. As the weeks dragged on, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The relentless drills, the teasing, and the constant underestimation were beginning to take their toll. She had made it through some of the toughest physical challenges, but each victory felt like a hollow one, achieved only after enduring ridicule and isolation. She was starting to question herself, not because she lacked the will to succeed, but because the pressure was becoming unbearable. The mocking had shifted from playful jabs to outright hostility. Some recruits started to outright sabotage her during training, hopping to see her fail. One afternoon, during a timed obstacle course, Sarah's ropes were cut before she even began the climb. It wasn't an accident, it was intentional. When she confronted the culprit, they just smirked. "Should have stayed home," they sneered. "The army's not for soft people like you." The words stung, not because they were true, but because they echoed everything Sarah had been hearing since the day she arrived. Everyone expected her to quit. Everyone believed she would crack. It felt like the whole camp was against her. And for the first time since she arrived, Sarah considered walking away. She thought about packing her bags, returning to her small town, and leaving the mockery behind. Maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong here. That night, as she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, she was hit by a sudden wave of exhaustion, not just physical, but emotional. She felt the weight of the entire camp on her shoulders, the pressure to prove herself, to be something she wasn't sure she could be. Was she really cut out for this? Was she fooling herself? It was then that Sergeant Parker came by for his nightly rounds. Unlike the other instructors, he hadn't been cruel. He wasn't interested in breaking recruits with mockery. He wanted to see who had true grit. Sarah had noticed him watching her before, his piercing gaze always studying her when she thought no one was paying attention. That night, he sat down beside her bunk, his voice low but firm. "You think you're done here, don't you?" he said, his tone more matter-of-fact than accusatory. "You think you can't handle it, and that it'd be easier to quit." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She didn't trust herself to speak, lest her voice betray the doubt she was feeling. "You know," he continued, "I see it. You're tougher than anyone here gives you credit for, but you're not here to prove something to them. You're here to prove something to yourself." There was a long pause as he let the words sink in. "You want to quit. You'll have to do better than that. You'll have to show me you're better than that." It wasn't a pep talk. It wasn't meant to make her feel better. It was just the truth, laid out before her. The sergeant wasn't going to pity her. No one was going to rescue her from the ridicule. But if she really wanted to make it, if she really wanted to prove everyone wrong, it was on her to decide what kind of soldier she was going to be. That night, something shifted inside Sarah. The words of the sergeant echoed in her mind as she lay awake, staring at the dark ceiling. She realized that quitting wasn't the easy way out. It was just another form of failure. And she wasn't a failure. She had spent too much of her life being underestimated, and if she walked away now, she'd be handing them exactly what they wanted. She wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. At that moment, she made a silent vow to herself. She would push through, no matter how difficult, no matter how much it hurt. She wasn't going to let the mocking and sabotage break her. She wasn't going to let them win. The next day, when the drill sergeant called for a team run, Sarah was the first to step forward. She didn't say a word to the others. She just laced up her boots and took her place at the front of the pack. She had no intention of stopping. And no one would stop her. Not the recruits, not the instructors, and certainly not her own doubts. The turning point came during one of the most intense training sessions Sarah had endured yet. It was the final day of the obstacle course challenge, and the recruits had been working nonstop for hours, pushing their bodies to the limit. The day was blistering hot, and everyone was exhausted. The course was grueling: mud pits, wall climbs, and a stretch of razor-thin balance beams designed to break even the most seasoned recruits. But Sarah was ready. Her body ached. Her muscles screamed for rest, but the fire inside her refused to let up. She had come too far to quit now. The course was set up in teams, and the recruits were grouped into pairs. As the challenge started, Sarah was paired with another recruit, a bulky guy named Tom who had made her life miserable since day one. Tom had never let up on the insults, always quick to remind her of how out of place she was. He was a big guy, one of the strongest in the camp, and when he saw that Sarah was struggling to keep up with his pace during the first leg of the course, he began mocking her loudly, just like he always did. "Come on, little girl. You gonna let me finish this by myself?" Tom's voice boomed as he dashed ahead, leaving Sarah behind to navigate a tricky set of obstacles. The other recruits cheered and laughed from the sidelines, feeding off his energy. Sarah's chest tightened, and she could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her once again. But instead of falling behind, instead of letting the ridicule get to her, Sarah gritted her teeth. She wasn't going to be the joke anymore. She pushed herself forward, her body sore, her legs like lead, but her resolve solidifying with every step. The final obstacle was a massive wall climb. Most recruits needed a rope or some assistance to get over it, but Sarah had seen the others attempt it. She wasn't about to let Tom or anyone else see her fail. She ran up to the base of the wall, took a deep breath, and made a split-second decision. She threw herself at the wall with all her strength, gripping the rough edges with both hands, pulling herself up with everything she had left. Tom had already made it to the top and was turning around to shout something at her, but he stopped mid-sentence when he saw Sarah's determination. With a final push, she hauled herself over the edge of the wall, barely catching her breath. She could hear the other recruits gasping, watching in stunned silence. And then, as she swung her leg over the wall and landed on the other side, her shirt, soaked with sweat, rode up just enough for the recruits to catch a glimpse of her back. It wasn't just the muscular definition or the sweat-streaked skin that caught their attention. It was the tattoo. The design stretched across her back, a complex and intricate symbol that covered nearly her entire shoulder blade. It was unmistakably military in nature, but unlike anything most of the recruits had ever seen before. It wasn't just some generic emblem or unit insignia. This symbol was old, faded in some areas, yet still unmistakably clear in its meaning. The edges were sharp, precise, and designed with a deep, almost reverent sense of craftsmanship. The recruits were silent. The murmurs began immediately, not the mocking ones, but ones of pure curiosity. Someone whispered, "What's that? Is that a Special Forces tattoo?" The commander, who had been standing at the edge of the course observing, walked forward with a look of disbelief. His face paled as he saw the tattoo. His eyes locked on it for a moment too long, his mouth slightly open, as if the sight had caught him off guard. It was a reaction none of the recruits had expected. The tough-as-nails commander, who rarely showed any emotion, had just gone pale at the sight of Sarah's tattoo. Tom, who had been the loudest, the most mocking of her, fell silent. His face twisted into a confused look. "What the hell is that?" he muttered under his breath, still staring at her back. For a moment, Sarah stood there, catching her breath, unsure of what to say. The tattoo had always been a deeply personal part of her past, something she kept hidden for reasons she wasn't ready to share. It wasn't just an emblem, it was a reminder of a legacy, of a name she had been trying to leave behind. But in that moment, as the entire camp stood in silence, Sarah realized something profound. She wasn't the weak recruit anymore. She wasn't the one they could laugh at. She had earned their attention, and maybe, just maybe, their respect. The commander, still visibly shaken, cleared his throat. "All right," he said, his voice hoarse, as he motioned for the recruits to continue. "You all saw what just happened. Don't forget it." He gave Sarah one last look, a silent acknowledgement of something only he understood. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off. And just like that, Sarah had gone from the recruit everyone mocked to the one they all couldn't ignore. The silence that followed the reveal of Sarah's tattoo was deafening. No one spoke, but the air seemed to hum with questions. The other recruits stood frozen, their eyes flicking between Sarah and the commander. Tom, the loudest of them all, was now the quietest. His face, once confident and smug, had taken on an almost fearful expression as he processed what he had just seen. No one had expected Sarah to have something like that on her back, and even fewer could understand why the commander seemed so rattled. After a long, tense pause, the commander finally spoke, but it wasn't to anyone in particular, it was more to himself. "I didn't think you'd be the one." His voice trailed off, almost like he was talking to a ghost. He quickly cleared his throat and straightened his posture, shaking off the momentary lapse. "All right, move it. Everyone back in line. Let's finish this course," he barked, his usual drill sergeant authority returning. But the sharpness in his tone didn't have the same sting as before. The commander's words no longer carried the weight of a man in control. They were clipped, almost guarded. As Sarah made her way off the course, she caught a glimpse of the commander out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't looking at her with the usual harsh scrutiny or the thinly veiled disapproval. This time his gaze held something else, something closer to acknowledgement. It was fleeting, but it was there. It wasn't pity, it wasn't admiration. It was a recognition of something that Sarah had been trying to hide for so long. When the day's training finally ended, Sarah thought she might get a chance to retreat to her bunk and have some peace. But as she walked toward the barracks, the commander stopped her. He was standing outside his office, his face still holding that unreadable expression from earlier. "Private," he said, his voice low but firm. "A word." Sarah, already feeling the weight of the day, hesitated but then nodded. She had no idea what he wanted, but she wasn't about to back down. She approached him, trying to keep her nerves steady. "Your tattoo," he began, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something. "You know, it's not the kind of thing most recruits carry." His tone wasn't judgmental, but there was a strange weight behind it, like he was trying to make sense of something that didn't quite add up. "I didn't ask for anyone's attention, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady but her stomach twisting. She wasn't sure where this conversation was headed, but she could feel the tension building. The commander gave a small nod. "I can see that, but you need to understand something." He paused, and for the first time, Sarah saw a flicker of respect in his eyes, a rare thing from someone as stoic and tough as him. "That tattoo, that insignia, it's not something you just walk around with. It means something, and it means something to me." Sarah didn't know what to say. She'd never expected to hear those words from him, certainly not after everything she'd been through at boot camp. But she wasn't going to give him a chance to pity her. "I'm not here to be anyone's charity case, sir. I'm here to prove I'm worthy of this, and I don't need a history lesson to do that," she said, her voice rising with a quiet defiance. The commander's lips curled into a thin smile. "I wasn't offering a history lesson, Private, but maybe you should consider that what you've got on your back isn't just a story, it's a mark of strength. And whether you like it or not, it's going to come with expectations." He turned away then, his usual authoritative posture returning. "You've earned my respect today. Don't waste it." With that, he walked into his office, leaving Sarah standing there, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't a warm embrace of approval. It wasn't some big speech about how amazing she was. It was simpler than that. The commander had acknowledged her strength, not the kind that could be measured by how much she could lift or how fast she could run, but the kind that was deeply rooted in her past. It was the kind of strength that didn't just fade away with mockery. It withstood it, it absorbed it, and it grew. And in that moment, Sarah knew that the respect from the commander was different. He had seen the real her, the one that had been hidden beneath the surface all along. And for the first time since she arrived at boot camp, Sarah didn't feel like she was fighting to prove something to anyone else. She was fighting for herself. The days that followed Sarah's tattoo reveal were marked by a subtle but powerful shift in the atmosphere at boot camp. What had once been an environment filled with mockery and whispered doubts began to change. The other recruits, who had once seen her as weak or out of place, began to look at her differently. It wasn't just because of her tattoo, it was because they had seen something else in her, a quiet, relentless determination that they couldn't ignore. It wasn't immediate. The whispers didn't stop overnight, and the stares still lingered whenever Sarah entered a room. But little by little, the tone shifted. Recruits who had once snickered behind her back now nodded in acknowledgement when they passed her in the mess hall or on the way to drills. They no longer saw the girl who struggled to keep up. They saw the one who refused to quit. Tom, the brash recruit who had been her biggest critic, was the first to show signs of respect. It happened during a particularly brutal drill, one that pushed the recruits to their limits. They were tasked with carrying heavy logs through a forested trail, and by the time Sarah reached the halfway point, her arms were shaking, her back sore, and her legs felt like they were about to give out. Tom, who had been charging ahead, heard her struggling and turned around, a scowl on his face. For a moment, Sarah braced herself for another round of taunts, but instead, he dropped the log he was carrying and jogged back to her. "Come on, little soldier," he grunted, his voice rough but genuine. "Don't let me show you up." It wasn't much, but it was everything. Tom didn't need to say more. His actions spoke volumes. He was no longer mocking her. He was helping her. And for the first time since arriving at boot camp, Sarah realized that she wasn't alone in this anymore. The camaraderie she had been craving was beginning to form, piece by piece. Even the instructors seemed to notice the change. During one of the final evaluations, as the recruits lined up for their physical assessments, Sergeant Parker gave Sarah a long look as she approached the obstacle course. He didn't offer the usual half-smile or sarcastic comment. Instead, he just nodded and said, "Good luck, Private. You've earned it." It wasn't much, but for Sarah it was enough. And then came the day of the final obstacle course. This was the day everyone had been dreading, the day that would determine who could cut it and who would be sent home. It was the ultimate test of strength, endurance, and mental fortitude. And for Sarah, It was the culmination of everything she had worked for. The first time she'd stepped onto that course, she had been full of doubt, ridiculed by her peers, and weighed down by the belief that she didn't belong. But now, as she stood at the starting line, the sneers and doubts had faded into the background. She wasn't fighting to prove anyone wrong anymore. She was fighting for herself. When the horn blew, Sarah sprinted forward with everything she had. She tackled each obstacle with the confidence that had been slowly building inside her over the past few weeks. The wall that had once seemed impossible to climb, she scaled it with ease. The rope swing that had tripped her up the last time, she flew through it. She was unstoppable. And when she crossed the finish line, breathless and covered in mud, the recruits who had once mocked her were now cheering for her. Tom was the first to slap her on the back. "Hell of a run, Sarah," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "Didn't think you had it in you." But Sarah didn't need his praise. She didn't need anyone's approval. She had finished that course, not for them, but for herself. And as she stood there, surrounded by the recruits who had once doubted her, she knew one thing for certain: she had earned their respect. The tattoo on her back, once a symbol of her hidden past, now represented something else: her strength, her resilience, and her refusal to be defined by anyone else's expectations. It was a mark of who she truly was, a reminder of what she was capable of, and no one could take that away from her. The final day of boot camp arrived, and Sarah stood at the front of the formation, her chest filled with a mixture of pride, exhaustion, and a sense of finality. The drill instructors walked past the recruits one last time, inspecting each of them, ensuring they had the strength, grit, and mental toughness required to graduate. The whole camp was buzzing with anticipation. This was the moment that would mark the end of their journey, the culmination of everything they had fought for over the past several weeks. And for Sarah, it was more than just the end of boot camp. It was the end of being underestimated, the end of being mocked for something she could never change. She glanced around at the faces of the other recruits. Many of them were looking at her differently now. Some, like Tom, had come to respect her. Others, like the instructors, had begun to see her not as a liability, but as someone who had the heart and the spirit to make it. She had fought for her place here, and now she had earned it. There was no more doubt in her eyes. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. Sergeant Parker stood in front of the group, his eyes scanning the faces of each recruit. His usual stern demeanor had softened just a bit over the course of boot camp, and today there was an almost imperceptible sense of pride in his gaze. He stopped in front of Sarah, who stood tall and confident despite the weariness in her bones. "You made it, Private," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "You proved yourself when others counted you out, and for that I respect you." It was a small moment, but it meant everything. Those few words from the sergeant, who had seen it all, who had pushed her to the breaking point, meant more than any compliment or pat on the back from the other recruits. It was a validation of everything she had worked for. As the ceremony ended and the recruits were officially dismissed, Sarah took a moment to stand outside, taking in the view of the camp that had both broken her and rebuilt her. She felt the weight of her tattoo against her back, a silent reminder of her journey. No longer did it symbolize the past she had been running from. Now, it represented her strength, her perseverance, and her resilience. It was a badge of honor, not just because of the story it told, but because of how she had proven herself worthy of it. And as the recruits scattered to celebrate their graduation, Sarah found herself smiling, not because she had made it to the finish line, but because she had done it on her own terms. She had fought for her place in this world, and no one could ever take that away from her. Before she left the camp grounds, she took one last look around. She had found something here, something more than just physical strength or the ability to complete every challenge. She had found her ow,